thank you for coming out. I want to thank the organizers and thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. Krim and Mike for putting this on. It's a great conference. This is my second time here. I was here 2 years ago. Wasn't able to make it last year, but I think it's one of the really great conferences that I think that exists. So I'm going to try to continue to come every year. But like I said, let's get right into this. So this is my talk on an embedded device analysis approach for like network defenders. If you were playing buzzword bingo, you could probably just call it something like this: blue team approach to red team embedded device analysis process. So before we get into this is a disclaimer slide so that I don't get sued or you don't get sued and things like that. It's all open source, everything exists out there. So obviously this typical agenda stuff. But really quick, who am I? So I work for the Software Engineering Institute. It's part of Carnegie Mellon University, and specifically I'm on the CERT coordination team. So CERT stands for nothing, it's just CERT. We actually have the trademark on it. We, as in Carnegie Mellon University, does, and it exists. And we were originally the original CERT that existed. We're a federally funded research and development center, but in 1988, when the Morris Word happened, government came to CMU at the time and said, hey, you guys should really coordinate things that go on the internet. So at that point in time, it was answering university emails, because that what existed, and picking up a phone when someone would call about hey, I can't get access to my own internet, right? So we used to do instant response, you would call it, for everybody at that point in time. Obviously, after 9/11 and 2013 came around, DHS was stood up and sort of US CERT came to be. Now US CERT name actually has fallen off, but there's still DHS sort of taking over the role of instant response for the government of the United States. I also teach at a couple universities and my night job, I like to say. I enjoy it. I think it's important to give back. I'm probably not the smartest person in the room, but I'd like to at least give some knowledge, and people hopefully exponentially, when they're 10 years, 12 years out, they'll be exponentially better than I am. I do the B-side CTF. I used to work at FireEye, so I get the whole product world, the consulting world. Did a consulting gig, which was the longest 11 months of my life. Enjoyed some of it, but I'm glad I did it when I was younger. I will never do consulting again. And then I used to work for Department of Defense, or better yet, I worked for NSA for about 4.5 years. I enjoyed everything I did there, had a lot of fun. And then, speaking engagements and other, anything that I publish is out there in the SCI digital library. I'll give you some links to documentation at the end. So let's get into this. So I was doing, as you saw in the last slide, I used to be on our vulnerability analysis team. Well, now I'm back on the malware analysis team doing reverse engineering, again, of malware type indicators. But I was doing more vulnerability discovery, exploit development type things, and I was looking at embedded devices, and I said, hey, I want to pick up these IoT devices, right, and look at them and stuff like that, and let me go and see if someone else has done some interesting research, or at least put together a scientific model of how we can do this. Going back to 5th grade science class, you start with this, you have a hypothesis, and then we follow these steps. Well, nothing like that existed. There's some great blog posts or this article from this company and so forth and so on, and a lot of it just winging it, right? And I said, that's not going to work for me, especially where we work, where we have to put together repeatable processes that our sponsors can use, we can reuse, anybody can reuse, right? So I did a hard pause in my analysis. And I said we needed a methodology, and maybe I'm not the best person to do it, but I'm going to put it out there for everybody. I also was writing a lot of repetitive grep statements to find stuff when I was looking at embedded devices. I'm like, not going to do that anymore. So I wrote together a tool, you can call it, Python script. I'm not a developer. I like to write what I like to call analyst code. It works majority of the time. But the goal is to create a repeatable process that creates thorough results, ensure that every component can be at least minimally tested by anybody to start out with, right? Anybody can pick this methodology up and use it on anything, right? And then create an open source tool to share, right? I like to give back. It's nice being outside of the intelligence community world where I can do publications and speak, whereas inside there, you can't even think about doing that. So when I say embedded devices, you can also lump in Internet of Things into there. I like to put embedded devices at the umbrella for it, and then Internet of Things is underneath that, because your car is an embedded device, a satellite terminal that goes on a maritime ship is an embedded device. And then there's a vulnerability research process that didn't exist. And then, like I said, create this concrete methodology that anybody can use. So really the methodology or the red team approach, right? So I'm going to talk about that first, and then we'll flip it on its head, I like to say, and we'll talk about like the network defense to that. So this is sort of the methodology myself, and at the time, my intern, but now she's my colleague as well. She got hired on to do more of the vulnerability type work. But this is the type of methodology put together, right? So we have embedded device list creation, and then we do go into information gathering. We do firmware analysis. We look at the web app. We look at the mobile app. Do a little bit of hardware analysis, where I think that actually scares a lot of people. And then you do look, and then the vulnerability analysis side of things. So embedded device list curation is just a long word, a long phrase to say, like, figure out all the devices out there that you want to look at, right? If you want to look at webcams for this specific company, like, let's get all the information about those webcams for that specific company, right? The idea is to access the physical device, right? Actually having that will help you do more complete results. Obviously, if you can't get access to that embedded device, hopefully there's a way to get you the access to the firmware that's out there, right? So, and then that's at the same point in time, collect all the firmware. If the company posted on their website, download all of it. All versions, new and old, just download it all. And we'll talk about why downloading the old version will help you in sort of a red team approach at some point in time. On a more recent thing I was looking at, why going back into like the first version, when I had version 7, I was able to find a password, right, that was then encrypted, but then the first version it was just there in plain text, right? So the next step is really just going into information gathering, right? Collecting all the information about past and present vulnerabilities and exploits associated with that device. And maybe even outside the device, maybe everything that's associated with that company's products, right? As we'll talk later, lots of files are shared across all the firmware, right, for all types of devices. So something you might find for a camera might actually work for a router. So really just identifying the vulnerabilities, and then identifying any exploits associated with them, and any other pertinent information that you think is valuable at that point in time. Maybe articles, this, X vendor wrote up about the product, Y vendor wrote up about, this different product, maybe malware that hit this product, right? As we can see more recently in like the Mirai stuff and the VPN filter information. Next, we'll jump into what's, this firmware analysis, right? So ideally, you choose a device that you're able to gather the associated firmware off the website, and you just basically analyze it. When you break it down, typically it's an embedded file system. Most of the time, it's a squash FS file system, but it's just a Linux. It looks like Linux. It's basically a Linux-like file system itself. So binwalk is your nice open source tool that you can use to theoretically extract information from the firmware blob, right? And then the tool that I wrote called Trommel will help you sort of sift through the embedded device files to identify potential vulnerable indicators. Long way to say is like, I search for different things that could point you down to a path that, hey, maybe there's a hard-coded password, maybe this config file has information in it that talks about how like logins and different IP addresses associated, so forth and so on. Like I said, it's out there on GitHub. I'll show you the link later. I like to say it takes out like 75% of the manual process. So when you run the script, though, you're still going to get a couple different text files that you need to parse through. Of course, there's going to be false positives, right? If they're writing a comment that says password, right? Obviously, that's not the password, but still might point to more information about a file, or look at files that you might not have even thought about looking at. And the nice thing is that I found a tool called vFeed that's out there. It's an open source, curated vulnerability and intelligence database wrapper. This individual, NJ, has put together this database where he just pulls in all the information about CVEs, exploit DB, throws in a nice database, right? And so I'll pivot and use that database to say, okay, I have this software on this machine, tell me all the CVEs and Metasploit modules and exploit DB information associated with this CVE, right? And you can kind of expand there, and you can include Nmap scripts as well. The database is pretty extensive. I use just a sliver of it, right? And you can use a lot of it. So there's free and paid versions of it. I use the free version, so anybody can use the free version. It's sort of like the Snort SIGs. It only gets updated once a month for the free users, that is. So as we all probably know, most embedded devices have sort of web app front end to it, right? So Obviously, you should probably test this for some of the most common web application vulnerabilities. You can use a lot of open source tools out there. Nikto and Zap are obviously the free. There is a free version of Burp Suite, but paying for like a little out of pocket, it gives you more capabilities. But it's able to intercept that traffic and look passively and actively look for different types of vulnerabilities. So mobile application, I think, is sometimes skipped in the process, but a lot of these devices, you can access it through the mobile application. So it's very similar to the web application as far as my testing processes were. And we pull down the APKs, right, the Android package files themselves. And using another open source tool, APK tool, it basically decompresses that whole APK. And then you can run Trommel on it to then find any of the similar indicators that you would find in the firmware file system itself. And then jump into like the scary part, like, oh, hardware analysis, like, well, I don't want to do that. Well, there's a lot you can get from that and to take into account, right? So the hardware analysis part, I broke down into 5 simple steps, right? Look at the actual device. If you physically have the device, look at the device, right? What's on the device? What kind of information is on there? Usually there's some kind of, is there any radio frequencies associated? It's going to be registered in the China database, the FCC database in the United States, the IC database in Canada, and so forth. So you can go to those databases and then see what kind of information they submitted to that database and what kind of radio frequencies it's using, what range it's using, which then can help you with further analysis that we're not going to talk about, but could be future steps. Then once you're done with that, open it up. What's on the printed circuit board itself, right? What's on that PCB? What chips does it have? What can you identify about those chips? Really, you're looking for that flash component on there, right? Because that flash component typically is where the firmware is going to be installed. Try to dump the flash memory off of there. And then once you're at that process, you can extract it and analyze it just like you would if you grabbed it from the website. And the idea then is compare what was on the device to what was on the website. And the times I've done this is that even if this device says it's version 4 and I pull version 4 from the website, there's still differences in there. So it's a little interesting. Like, is this version 4 better than what's on here? Probably. They probably found mistakes after they push it out because they assume that when everybody gets a product, they're going to hit update firmware, right? I beg to differ. That doesn't always happen. Couple, pro tips here. Not that I'm a pro, but things to think about is once you're doing this extraction of the firmware, like how are you going to how are you going to supply power to the device? Do you have to supply power to the chip, or do you power it from the component I use, the bus pirate, right? The pin layout, make sure you don't swap it, right? So data out goes to data in, and data in goes to data out, right? You have to cross those, obviously, because it's reading from there, right? You get it wrong, you get a bad read. It'll still read it, but it's not going to look like anything. You're not going to be wondering why. Using micro clips as opposed to an SOIC clip, I found was very fruitful. I would spend numerous times banging my head why it wasn't, extracting the thing when it looks like it was making good connections, and that bumps into the next bullet. Make sure that what you have is good connections. More recently at Geek Week, I was trying to do the same thing. The tools I had, Bus Pirate and FlashROM, which is an open source tool that you can easily install on Kali. Understood this chip, but I wasn't getting good reads. So that tells me my micro clips that we're using weren't actually clipping nicely onto the pins off the flash chip. But we didn't have the capabilities, nor do I want to try to extract that flash chip and then look at it that way. Now that is a way you could do it if you have a hardware shop that does things like that. But like I said, that's a more advanced type hardware analysis. I want to do something basic that anybody can do. So like I said, there's a couple tools that I use, Bus Pirate and then FlashROM, right? And I'll talk later about. Bus Pirate does cost a little bit, like less than $40 US, and then FlashROM you can open source, and they actually started supporting it again. They pulled it over to GitHub, and people are actually supporting it again, right? Whereas a year ago there wasn't support for it for 2 years, right? So it's nice that it's actually being supported again. And then vulnerability analysis, right? So research and testing, this is broken down into 3 little steps as well, right? So review the firmware updates for the patches, typically found in the release notes. What information can you gather from there? What actually, did they fix before? Did they talk about what it fixed? Did it just say bug fix? Was that probably a remote code execution? I would say no, but we don't know because they maybe not give a lot of detail. But if they have release notes, take a look at those release notes and tell you what was affecting it before ideally, maybe. Test the actual exploits against the device. If you physically have it, might as well fire it up, and if someone wrote like a nice Metasploit module for it, give it a go at the device, right? You have a closed network, ideally you'll be doing this on. You'll be able to see if that's actually working. I would actually test also similar exploits for other devices that the vendor has. Like I said, lots of the shared object files and library files are very similar across all the devices. And at the end of the day, if it's just in your wheelhouse, you can write your own proof of concept. We did this on the device we're looking at, right? We wrote like a web app sort of exploitation because we found a flaw and that nothing existed before. But the most important part, right? Vulnerability disclosure. So working for the CERT Coordination Center, we've been coordinating vulnerabilities for the government and other security researchers out there for as long as I've known. I think that started more in the mid-90s, where people would submit bug to us and we'd communicate. So we have a very good relationship with lots of vendors. So if you're a researcher out there that's doing a lot of bug bounties and on physical devices, and you're finding things and you're trying to do the proper thing to disclose it to the vendor and they're not responding or they don't even have a process to do so, reach out to us after you've done try to talk to the vendor. We also have a guide out there that you can read. It's not it's very dry, but it's a guide for coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Because we want to encourage you to do it properly, and we'll work with you, and we have our connections back to most vendors to say, hey, like, this is pretty serious. You should probably take a look at that. Typically, we're involved in a lot of the process that you hear about different other bigger vulnerabilities that were out there, and because the government's always going to come to us and say, hey, what do you know about, for instance, like Spectre Meltdown and things like that, right? So something more major, but we're involved a lot. So take a look to this, this coordinated vulnerability disclosure guide. If you have any questions, let myself know. Reach out to the contacts on there. And if you're doing this type of work, try to be, responsible with your disclosure. We're all researchers out there, and we're worried about, drawback from the vendor and things like that, or companies like Huawei where they say you can't look at our devices, that it's illegal or it breaks our EULA, things like that. But you still should do what you need to do. And if you have problems, definitely reach out to us. We'll help coordinate it as best as we can. So that's sort of the red team approach to this. So flipping it on its head, applying the same methodology for network defense, or that blue team approach, right? So nice quote I found a while back was, obviously more IoT means more value, but also means greater risk, right? And I think we all sort of think about this, and maybe we as the security researchers think about it, and whereas other big companies, it's really pushing for the C-suite people who weren't analysts at one point in time, trying to convince them the importance to take a look at the devices before we put them on our networks. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but so due to the fact that embedded devices are becoming more ubiquitous across the it's increasing the threat landscape. It's increasing the ways our adversaries can get in. So you might want to start or continue discussion with your network defenders or yourselves, right, to understand what embedded devices reside on your network and how you're going to actually protect those devices themselves. So the network defense approach to looking at embedded device list creation, right? So asset awareness, like what devices do you have on your network? Are you aware of the devices on your network, right? You might have different security groups that are testing different devices, right? Are they testing devices that can get out to the internet? Are they a closed network? Obviously, what devices do you have on your network, but what devices do you have to plan to add to your network? Have you actually thought about that? What you're going to do and how you're going to handle them once they come onto your network? Obviously, it probably makes sense to pick more than one vendor that has a similar product and really take a look at both of them, the pros and cons of each. Understand the features, but the technical details, right? Like what components they have built into them, what components do they not? Do you actually need all the components they have built in, or something that's more scaled down better for your environment? And then is it actually applicable to your network, right? Do you really need it at the end of the day? So information gathering, right? So basically, at this point, you're looking at the threat landscape associated with the device, right? Has the device or similar devices consistently been riddled with vulnerabilities or known exploits? Like that should be something you should look into. Like, is your device that you're going to be purchasing always showing up on like the VPN filter type reports? Has it always been attacked by the Mirai botnet, type things that will come in our future, right? Where does that align with that? Take a look at and understand what's going on with there. really important is how often do they implement patches, the vendor itself, right? So for your devices, if something comes out, how quickly do they do it? Are they actually implementing patches for the specific device? Is it still supported? Is it not? Have they, how are those patches going to affect, your day-to-day activity? And then what reviews, I would take a look at the reviews. One funny quote I saw recently is someone said, shout out to people who rate and review things, because I don't rate or review things, but I'd like to know how things are rated and reviewed. I think a lot of us might fall in that category. I know I am. Like, I don't rate or review anything, but I'd like to know what someone else has said about this device and what things they have and whether it's technical or not. So looking at the firmware analysis process. So do you know what's actually on the device? What is it running? What version is it running? Is it actually the version that it says it's running? You can still analyze this as we were doing earlier. If you have the device or thinking about getting the device, maybe buy one of them and analyze it itself. Make sure you can compare what's actually on the system itself. Do you know what software is packaged? Is this device by default, right? What's on there? Do they put a lot of third-party software on there? Did they write their own applications to put on there themselves? Have those had associated vulnerabilities? And third-party software they have installed on there, is there known vulnerabilities for that? How often does the firmware get updated, right? What's the time frame? If something big comes out, how quickly are they to market to put out a patch for that? Looking at the change logs themselves, like the development support, right? If this is like an everyday webcam that everybody uses, like, is that getting as much attention as like their main router they might have on owned by the same company? Obviously, the tool I wrote in could also assist with this part, right? You can run across the firmware looking for things like hard-coded vulnerabilities or software out of date, associated vulnerabilities or exploits with that software. Like, again, is there custom software? Out-of-date software is notorious. Most of these embedded devices have something called BusyBox. I'm sure you're all aware of, right? They package all different types of the GNU core utilities in the BusyBox, and you can sort of customize BusyBox to include what you want in there. But they're not even installing the most up-to-date, stable version of BusyBox. Something you buy today that's brand new is going to have probably an old version of BusyBox. Maybe this is the first version, right? I can tell you the first version itself has like 6 known CVEs associated with it, right? And like a couple like exploit DB modules associated with it. Now, is it going to work against your device? Maybe, maybe not, right? But like I always like to say, is just because something doesn't have an exploit, and as for a CVE, doesn't mean that if someone didn't have enough time and energy, could they develop one? So looking at the web application, right? Is it password protected? Is it you're using the default stuff? Have you disabled remote administration? Is this something you actually need to take into account? If not, why do you need remote administration of IoT or embedded devices on your network? Why can't you just take care of them like by VPNing in and things like that? Who and what can access that web application or device, right, to take into account? Obviously, have you changed the default credentials? I bought a recent little mini router to put into, like when I travel, right, and create like a hotspot if they give you an Ethernet into your hotel room. The first thing it steps when you set up is like change your defaults. So that's actually nice to see the device actually forcing you to change the defaults. But if it doesn't, have you changed the defaults? And obviously we can answer that a lot of people don't do this, because that's how Mirai was successful. That's why VPN filter was probably successful. But the bigger thing is, have you actually considered the web application of the embedded device that's on your network as part of your everyday assessment, right? Probably not. Probably people forget about it, that it has a web app front. But if you're testing your normal website and other web apps you have for your business or that you use, right, why wouldn't you test the ones associated with the IoT devices you have on your network? So looking at the mobile application, right, it's very similar to the web application. Do you need to actually use the mobile application to access the device? Sometimes it is true you might need the mobile application to at least set it up initially before you can then pivot to like the web app front end that you can access from your network. But who has access to that? Are they willing to keep is the company itself willing to keep that application up to date? But also, is that person keeping their phone up to date that's accessing it, right? Someone has to have the web app on their phone, right, somehow, some way. How does the web application access the device? Are there different ports it's going to be using? Like, do you have to take that into account? What kind of traffic is going to create? What footprint is it going to create on your network itself? What permissions? So this is where Tromla actually looks at, like, what permissions does that device be able to access on your phone, right? Does it need to access things it shouldn't need to access to? And if so, why? And do you actually need to use the mobile application? Obviously, is the vendor updating the mobile application? Take that into consideration. And is the application from their website, or is it from the associated app stores that exist, right? You can download both types of applications from any website sometimes. You're wondering then why did they push it through the curation process to get it to the Apple Store or the Android application store? Take that into consideration. For hardware analysis, right, you can, biggest thing is obviously change the defaults that are actually on the device, right? Just because it uses this, RFC 1918 IP address, like you can change it from a 192.168 network to a 10, right? You don't have to use what's on the back of the device. You can force it to use other things. You can change the information on there, but I would try to change that information. What information's in these databases that exist, if it does have radio frequency communications, right? What does exist in there? Is there, does it not have Bluetooth, but it has a Bluetooth chip inside of it? Like, why does it have that? And I know medical devices were notorious for this, for like putting Wi-Fi chips in their device because down the road we'll use it, right? But we're not going to use it now. But then they leave it wide open, right? This is a very common problem. It's probably still to this day. And then think about other ways you can harden the device, right? Scanning the device itself. Well, how can you lock down the device, right? If it's sitting in and it's plugged in down here, what happens if someone unplugs it, right? You got to consider that not everybody's nice. Maybe it's in an open space. Maybe you have stuff inside a hospital, so forth and so on. Who can actually get access to that? Notoriously, you see lots of like Ethernet cables plugged in right underneath the device. Why didn't they just put that behind the wall? Things to consider. So vulnerability analysis, right? At minimum, perform at least your own vulnerability scans across the devices. See what's there. See how it pops up. Like is there anything that the typical applications that you can run across it? But does the vendor have, the big thing is, the vendor have a disclosure process? Like if you do find something, and maybe you're not like a red teamer, but you find these flaws, like maybe we still want to tell the vendor, hey, like this web app is showing up with like all these different indicators of vulnerabilities, like maybe can you fix this, right, and push out an update, right? Do they have a way to do that? How does the vendor communicate information about patches itself? Is it putting the proper information inside a change log? Is it telling you why this one has been updated? What type of patches did it make? Like I said earlier, did it just say bug fix, right? It always makes you wonder when a vendor finds their own remote code execution flaw in their own code, like they're not submitting this for a CVE, right? They're quickly trying to patch it before someone else finds it. So that's sort of the flip it on its head type approach. I moved pretty quickly through that. But one thing I haven't talked about before is budget. Everybody's like, well, how do I budget for doing this myself as opposed to maybe outsourcing it? So the nice thing is that when I created this, I thought about that, and I said, like, you can probably do 90% of this methodology to perform analysis at no cost, right? Only on the hardware side is where you start to get some costs, right? You can even leave that out, right? Or you can do just bits and pieces of it. If you do have a limited budget, and I say limited by like $100, you can pick up a Wi-Fi dongle itself. You can pick up a bus pirate, and do these things, right? These are just suggestions, not endorsements. And if you have a larger budget, right, you can then take care of a few other options, right? Around $1,500 itself, right? You can buy the Wi-Fi dongle, the bus pirate. Maybe you have other frequencies. You can do, look at the Hack RF1, which covers more of a range of frequencies on the device. You can buy a license for Burp Suite. You can buy a license for Binary Ninja to do some reverse engineering of the applications off of the device. If it has Bluetooth, you can buy the Ubertooth. So, the past, present, future work, right? So the work of this was done. This methodology is out there. We apply it to a couple different web cameras. In the paper itself, we talk about one itself. I've applied it to other embedded devices since then that are not typically IoT, and I still follow this process. Ideally, there's lots still that I didn't cover, but didn't even write about, didn't take into consideration, right? Actually looking at the radio frequency analysis, looking more at Wi-Fi, looking at Bluetooth, looking at other, maybe they have Zigbee or Z-Wave built into it. As a network defense approach, do you allow Wi-Fi or Bluetooth on your network? Maybe you don't, right? If so, How are these devices segmented? Does the device operate on other frequencies, right? Is this going to affect other products that you have? Is there going to be an overlap in channels? Is it going to cause some noise in the network? So actually, then another approach that we're putting together is looking at the other devices off there, right? ARM and MIPS files from the device, creating little scripts that you could do for some typical low-level reverse engineering, right? As a network defense approach, like I'm not a reverse engineer, but I still care about what's on there. So you can think about what is the vendor running on the device, how much third-party software is on the device, and then is this information vulnerable? If you didn't really want to get into the whole reverse engineering aspect, you can still cover these things that I still think fall into that bucket. I didn't look at anything iOS. It's a lot harder to get iOS applications than it is to get your hands on an Android APK itself. But how do those two applications differ? For each device. Comparing it that way as well. And does the device support both sides? Is the developer, the vendor itself, actually putting out iOS and an Android application for the device? And then this is the big thing is network mapping right in the footprint of the device on the network. So the network defense approach is like what ports are open on the device? A big thing. What does the traffic look like as it's talking? Is it in different states as well, in like an idle or can this information be easily altered or spoofed, right? Can something else make itself look like that? For instance, one good comparison is like the Philips Hue light bulbs. Even in the off state, it sends about 2 million packets a day. It's consistently updating and talking out to the network, right? That's in the off state, right? I didn't test it in the on state, how much more or less it does. So a couple of closing thoughts, right? So this methodology was developed to create a macro level process to do embedded device vulnerability analysis, to put together more comprehensive results and actionable results that you can actually take and use. Create an open source tool you can use. We're trying to expand the methodology. It's going to be a little harder now that I'm back in the malware world as opposed to vulnerability analysis world, but it's still my little side project stuff I like to do. And it shows you, too, how you can take a red team process and turn it into blue team. Some might call that purple team nowadays, but it's a way you can spin it on its head. So this is my information, how you can get a hold of me. Madison Oliver, my colleague now, helping down the original path of this methodology, so I want to thank her. The paper's out there. If you just SCI Digital Library, search for my name or Madison's name, it'll be out there. Trommel's out there on GitHub. If you just search CC or search Trommel. I've been asked why the name Trommel. Trommel is a tool you use during mining that you shake and all the nice stuff like sits on top. That's how I got to that. I thought sieve sounded weird. That's another word that does the same thing, right? But